Welcome to all of you who are signing in a little bit early for today's program. Let us know where you're from. You can post something in the chat box. It'd be great to let us know where you're from around the world. We're glad you're with us. And as always, we'll try to start on time in about 4 minutes from now. And when you post in the chat, do it to everyone, not just the hosts and panelists. And I see we have people from all over the world, from Los Angeles to Salt Lake City, Baltimore. We have people in England, Israel, so many people. We have Wisconsin, Toronto and Canada, Cape Cod. We have people from right here in New York City. People in Florida, the Upper West Side, people in Colorado. Someone I see in Alaska. Welcome, glad you're with us. From the Netherlands. Valley Village, California. Inglewood, Florida. San Francisco. Rocky Mount, Missouri. Glad you're with us. People from Montreal, people from Oklahoma. Modi'in in Israel, welcome, glad you're with us. New Zealand, Joan Gladwin in New Zealand, glad you're with us, welcome. For everyone who's logging in, we are about 2 minutes away from getting started. We'll try to start on time at 2 o'clock here Eastern time. And in the meantime, why don't you let us know where you're from, and you could post a message in the chat. Make sure you do it to everyone so that everyone can see. People from Charleston, South Carolina, Palm Beach Gardens in Florida, Pittsburgh, Chicago, Montreal, Knoxville, Tennessee, Efrat in Israel, welcome. Providence, Rhode Island, Charlotte, North Carolina. For everybody who's logging in now, we're going to get started in about a minute. Let us know where you're from, post a message in the chat, and it'll be great to see where you're all participating, from where you're all participating. Zoltan from Hungary, welcome, glad you're with us. Rochelle from Ottawa, Canada. We have from Vancouver in Canada, Alberta in Canada, well represented in Canada today. Johannesburg in South Africa, Alaska, Virginia, Toronto, Northridge, California, London, another person in England, Jerusalem in Israel, glad you're with us. South Australia. I saw someone just mention my name, but it went by too quickly. So you can message me directly. Okay, we are at the 2 o'clock mark here in New York City. And we are so glad that so many are joining us for today's presentation from around the world. And this is a very exciting topic and a fascinating topic. And our speaker is going to show you the methodology for researching names and towns, of how you can go about doing this on your own. You can ask questions along the way, compose them in the Q&A box. Please keep them general in nature, as we always ask, so that we can try to find something that will be of benefit to the broader audience. There should be a few minutes for questions at the end of the program. And then we also will send out supplementary material that Debbie has prepared that will give you additional information and also contact information. The session is being recorded, so if you have to leave early or if you want to watch it again, it will be available to you. There are 2 ways to be notified of when the webinar is available, for the recording is available. One, it's on our YouTube. We're going to put the video on our YouTube channel. So you can subscribe to the JewishGen YouTube channel, and that way you'll be notified when the video is live. The other thing you can do, and I hope you will, is subscribe to our JewishGen discussion group, which is an amazing opportunity to connect with thousands of researchers from around the world. And we post messages on the group to let people know when the video is available. So subscribe to our YouTube channel, subscribe to our discussion group, and you will get to stay informed. As I mentioned, there will be supplementary material that is sent out. The handout was previously sent out, and you should have it in the emails that you received today. And I'll also post it in the chat momentarily. A little bit about our speaker, Debbie Shaw. Debbie is the past president of the Jewish Genealogical Society of Colorado. She is a well-known speaker, speaks at international Jewish genealogy conferences. She's the owner of oriGen Genealogy, and of particular interest for us today, she has researched 8 great-grandparents going back to the early 1800s and is a specialist in finding and verifying Jewish names and towns of origin. So Debbie, we're so glad that you're with us today. I welcome all of you who are joining us. And without further ado, I pass it over to Debbie.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I'm just going to share my screen here. We'll get started in just a second. So thank you so much for joining. I know there are people from all over the world, and I also am aware that this is being recorded. So if you're listening that way, that's great. The presentation that I'm going to give is actually applicable for people all over the world. And if you hang in there with me and wait until the end, and you will see how that works, and that the secret that I'm going to give you to doing some of this research is actually available no matter where you're located. So the great news about, I'm just going to put this in slideshow. Okay. Right. Okay, so the great news is that even if we don't have the information about our ancestors' names and original towns, they all left us clues. And if you had told me this 10 years ago, I would have argued with you and said, no, that's not true for mine. But in doing a large number of research that since then, I've actually found way more than I thought was ever possible for myself and for other people. So
Debbie, I think you're not in full screen mode.
Okay.
I think it's the use slideshow up on top.
Okay. I'm sorry.
No problem.
Okay, so I'm going to stop the share for a second, and I'm going to go back.
Just while Debbie is getting her presentation back on, I see a number of people have asked about the handout. So the handout was distributed in the emails that you received this morning and early this afternoon, and I'm going to post it in the chat momentarily.
So I'm in this slideshow. Is this okay or no?
I don't see it on your screen.
Okay.
So it's still in like presenter. You need to put it in presenter mode. I think if you click up on top, it says use slideshow.
Oh, yeah, I see it. Sorry. Okay.
There we go. Perfect.
Okay. All right. So in every case that I've investigated in the last, I'd say 5 years, for either myself or for other people, there are clues that our ancestors have left us that we might not have imagined. And what this means is that you've often got to start over and come back to yourself and work backwards. So a lot of people I have texted me or emailed me in the last 24 hours when they heard about this presentation, and they were asking me about distant relatives. So that's great. That's your question. Of course, we want to know the maternal great-grandfather's last name or or something else. And that's great to have that question, but you actually have to come back to the present and work back again. And I'm going to show you several examples of how I've done that. So everybody wants to find their shtetl in Poland or Belarus or the Ukraine, but if you don't have that information, you've got to start over. And this works for everybody, no matter where your ancestors immigrated. So I'm going to give you several cases, and all of this information is actually repeated on the handout, not my specific information, but what you can consider doing. So here I have a question about my great-grandfather. We knew very little about him. He died when my grandmother was only 2. My grandmother lived a long life, but again, how am I going to find out about this guy that my grandmother didn't even know? So what I look for first is my grandmother Dora's birth certificate. This is from FamilySearch.org, and I'll blow this up for you, and you can see that her name was Dora Sussman. She was born November 8th, 1902, and I knew that. So what's the big deal about that? But the important thing is that we now have a name of her mother's maiden name. It's often her original name, sorry. We often have a hard time researching women because of that, because of marriage names. And in this case, we found Sharpinovich. This is extremely important because when I go to JewishGen to look her up in Lithuanian records, I need that name Sharpinovich. So I got an important piece of information here that I didn't expect. But while I was in this record set, which is birth, vital records, birth, marriage, death, from 1902 to 1904, I went to look for her father's death, which I had heard was when she was 2. So again, I could not find this in any search. And you can see why, because his name was recorded as Louis, not Julius. And if you have a Yiddish accent, you can probably imagine that somebody could make that mistake easily because they were recent immigrants. They had only been in Connecticut for 14 months when my grandmother was born. And you can see here that she was almost 2. He died in October of 1904. And again, I found this just by going through the record set. It is not indexed and never will be probably. So I'm going to move on to another case. This is on my paternal side. I'm looking for this guy's ship record. This guy arrived alone at about 16. We had an actual date when he immigrated, and he married my great-grandmother in 1894. I have their marriage record. But there was confusion about when their first child was born. And when you meet with confusion, start to be really curious. And I'll show you why. I had to send myself sort of back to school to figure this one out, because I'll tell you why in just a second. Here's their marriage certificate. Remember, they're recent immigrants. They came over as teenagers on their own. They're probably lying about their ages here, but regardless, we get a lot of information. We get their addresses, that their name is spelled in 2 different ways, because remember that they were working from a completely different alphabet set, and they're learning English, and they're sounding it out to the best of their ability and writing it in English. So I went to the census. This is a 1900 US federal census. And fortunately in the US anyway, in 1900 and 1910, they asked women, how many children did you have and how many are now living? So you can see in the highlighted portion that my great-grandfather and grandmother were together 7 years. They had four children, or they'd been in the country 7 years is what they're reporting. They had 2 children at this point, Leanna, and James or Sam, which I'll get to later. Those 2 people I know about. Sam is my grandfather, but you can see there that she crossed out a 2 and wrote 4. She may not have understood the question. The census taker might have explained that to her. I don't know why, but we need to look really carefully at anything that was crossed out. So I went looking for those 2 babies that I had never known about. My grandfather probably may not have known about them. I'm not sure, but these were not babies that died at birth. This first baby was born in 1894, not Leah, but this baby, Sam, or Sem, was born in 1894, not long after they had gotten married. And this child died with a different name. Again, you have to check addresses. You got to really look for addresses to confirm the right person. But this baby had a different name when he died. And Alexander is actually a great-great-grandfather's name, which I'll show you later. But this is a clue. Gives you a clue because Jewish people tended to name babies, after grandparents or people who had died before them. So here's Leah's birth certificate. She was actually born in 1895, not 1894. I don't know if it's a confusion later on or they were trying to obscure the fact that a baby had died. I'm not sure, but there's her birth certificate, same parents, Sarah and Michael. And then a third baby was born that died after Leah. So by this time they had 3 babies. And again, I'm confirming a lot of this using addresses in Brooklyn and mapping everything. And so we learn here that Sarah was actually probably pregnant with her first child before she married Michael. They were both teenagers in New York. Your heart has to go out to them for this. And the next boy and girl were the same names as those 2 babies that died. This explained a lot to me about my grandfather, because I will explain this later, because he and my grandmother probably had 12 pregnancies and only one of them survived, my dad. So Alexander could be a grandparent's name. That's the name of the first baby that died. I'm gonna just check the 1910 census for some confirmation and verification, because you've got to do that with everything that you learn, and everything could be refuted at some point. But Sarah does report that she had 8 children by this time and 6 had died. So that's consistent. It isn't always. Their immigration years are all over the place. They sometimes report them accurately, sometimes they didn't. But think about it. If I could do a poll right now of everybody online, I would ask you, what is the year right now in Israel? And a lot of us don't really know. 5780, 5782, we're not really sure. They were coming out of a different, way of viewing a year. So that's why a lot of those things are inaccurate. So I went looking for, remember, I'm looking for the ship record, and I'm getting a lot of information that it's from 1891. I had an exact date. And again, this ship record is illegible. A lot of them are. But when you blow this up, this this is probably his ship record. I don't know this for sure, but he was 16. He did come over on that date. And as we will see later on a gravestone, his name was probably originally Yerachmael, not Michael. So I'm not positive about this, but this is probably his ship record. I was then looking for my grandfather's birth record, and he lived to be well into his 90s, but I could not find it for anything. You can see here it was misspelled. Don't take spelling as reality in any sense. You need to be very creative with spelling, but you can see how it was misspelled here. Italian Gen is actually spelled it a different way. At least I got the first name spelled correctly, but you can see why they spelled it incorrectly. Here's the birth record. And this is really hard to read. Again, people at this time when they were filling this out, English wasn't their first language. They were doing the best they could. And, there's misspellings there. Court Street is spelled with a K, but they were spelling it out. So here's his birth record. We get more information from this, or at least verification about where they were living, and we can track them on maps, because that's going to be important for tracking down other things. Okay, so going along with this theme of looking for information that's crossed out, you always want to look at an original record. Don't go with the indexed record at all, unless that's all you've got. Here's a US Census record from 1920. Actually, nice handwriting here, which is unusual. But you can see here that they were asked where they were from, and they said Russia, but the ones that are highlighted also gave the information Poland. But if you look down the record and look at Harry Goldberg, they could be related to Jacob, the Jacob Goldberg family above. And they give an actual village or a shtetl or a name. It's crossed out. Fortunately, it's written several times there, so you can have a shot at making those letters out. And JewishGen is going to become very important. I'm going to show you in a few minutes, because when you get a town name, you're going to want to use the town finder to help you figure that out. Here's another one, Laskers. We've got Laskers living right next to them. So you would want to investigate those people, or at least keep in mind that they could be related. And part of knowing the names that are living around your people's in census records is that those last names that you don't recognize could become important later on. Here's an English census from 1939. I'm going to tell you a story about this wine family later on, but you can see on the next page, and always go to the next pages on every document that you have. The naturalization papers are often more than one page, but at the very top, you see that the word wine is crossed out, and we get a woman's original name that we may or may not have known about. So moving on, this is a Sussman family from Wilna. Okay, so they were in Poland during the interwar period, but now this is Vilnius, Lithuania, and that's going to be important for you to know to do research through JewishGen or any other archive that uses the current country. Additional family members are often listed, and this is one way that we can perhaps know about someone that we wouldn't have known otherwise. This is a great-grandparent whose brother, my great-grandmother's brothers, were living with them at one point in time in 1910. So this Charles and Michael Berman were the brothers-in-law of the head of household, her husband. So I was able to then go and research those two guys who I did not have any idea about. So this is an interesting one. This is the 1910 census. The Levies are my direct relatives, but Fanny Levy, who is the third person up from the bottom, is my grandmother's sister. Unfortunately, she died in 1911, a year after this census was taken, leaving two little children, and she was married to Max Fenster. So you can see above that Louis Fenster and Sarah Fenster are living with them. And there's some Levies living in the same apartment building, likely. But the interesting thing is that when I went doing more research, it turned out that Max married Molly Topilsky after his wife Fanny died, in a few years after she died. So she was living as a boarder. She's reported as a boarder. In further research, I actually think she was a cousin. But again, there's a good example of how people with last names turned out to be related in the same apartment building or census record. So US state census records, we all know that the 1890 federal census didn't survive, but there are many states with census records. And this is an example of one. I was not born in 1950 or 1940, but these census records are more recent. So you can see that I actually appear on a census record that's online today. So all of these things are in your handout. The links are there. The list of information is all there in the handout. This is a New York State census. These are very important for doing Jewish genealogy in the US, but you can see here that the census taker just got a little bit mixed up. It was supposed to be last name first, first name second, and they just got mixed up at the one at the top, Aaron Thal. Aaron is actually the first name. And so you can see that when an index was done, it's not going to show up the way you might expect. Okay, so naturalization records. This is one that you would never have guessed. This man, Manuel Spector, had a name, Abraham Hamdowski, when he immigrated. So that's the name that's going to be important for doing further research. So these forms are not common, but they do exist. And also he reports his foreign residence as Białystok, which today is in Poland. Here's another example of one. You can sometimes find pictures of people on naturalization records, which is amazing. And often people did stop in Liverpool there's a poor Jews immigrant society in England, or there was one. And a lot of people stopped in Liverpool because they could afford the passage that far. And then they got on another ship. So sometimes you're looking for more than one ship when you're doing that kind of research. Here's another one that gives, again, they're going to do the best they can to spell the name. You can see that I spelled it differently once I did the research on JewishGen. But in this case, we get the original name of the immigrant and the location, which is in Belarus today. And he also reports Grodno. Grodno, through research, you can find out if something was a province or a specific town. It's just like me saying I'm from Colorado. Sometimes I say Denver, but I'm not really from either of those two specifically. I live in a small town. So here's another one. He's from Kupiškis, and he reports that that is now Lithuania. This guy helped us more than most. And here is my favorite record of all. This is my great uncle who came over as Sussman, but their name in Northeast Lithuania was Zisman. So if you know Hebrew, that's the difference between a Zion. It was a Zion in Hebrew, not a Samech. So when they translated it or transliterated it into English, it became an S and eventually Sussman. But this is as much proof as you can possibly get because you've got the two names on one document. So here's an index. This is an example of a birthplace and being reported on a naturalization paper as Abelnik, Russia. And when we go to JewishGen and use the town finder and put that name in, we get something that's very different. It's actually called Valbalninkas, Lithuania today. And we get all the different forms in Lithuanian, Russian, Yiddish, etc. And also we get where they are on a map based on time periods, because we all know that borders were shifting, and JewishGen does a great job of helping us out with that to figure out what something was called historically, what our ancestors might have called a place. So ship records, we don't only need last names, but we often need first names, because we all know that people change their names, either officially or unofficially. They might have changed their names before they got on a ship. They might have had stolen papers, but they did not change their names at Ellis Island. And I've given you a link on the handout for a very in-depth answer to why that is true, why they didn't change their names there, but they certainly did change their names. So here's an example of one of my ancestors who traveled as a young woman through Montreal. Why did she go through? A lot of our ancestors went through Canada. So don't just think that they all came through New York, or they came through lots of places. I have an example of someone who in World War I traveled through San Francisco to New York, because that was the passage that he could get at the time. So this woman, Sarah, is coming through Montreal by herself. I knew that she had children. I didn't know why. She is giving her address as 8.5 Oak Street in New Haven, Connecticut. She's reporting that she had cataracts. When I later asked her daughter about this, she said that this woman was very scared that she would get turned back and that she didn't want to be traveling with her young children if that were to be the case. So she came over in January of 1907, and we can see her here on the 1910 US Census. She changes her name to Jenny. She's with Jacob, her husband, and she's got some little children there, some of whom were born overseas and some additional ones in Connecticut. But we noticed here that her mother, at the very bottom, noticed that her mother, Sarah Silverman, is living with her. So I was doing research on the girls that had traveled. They must have come over at some point because they were here on the 1910 census, but I couldn't find anything. So I started researching their grandmother, Sarah Silverman. And when I found her ship record, I found all of the children. Their first names, Hannah was Anna, Dewary was Dora, Genendi was Gertrude, and Racy was Rosalie. And they traveled under their grandmother's last name, which was different from theirs. And you can imagine that if you were traveling with grandchildren overseas, or, you know, you might want them under your same name too, so that you wouldn't be questioned. But we would never find this information by going directly at looking and under their names. These names will never be indexed because that's not how we know them. And here's the second page of this ship record. We get information about where they're going. We can make confirmations about the fact that they're in New Haven on Oak Street, going to the right father and another son of Sarah Silverman's. And on the right, you can see that Racy, who definitely was on the ship record, but is not on the 1910 census, must have died between, okay, I've got a typo here. I said 2007, it should be 1907. Sorry about that. She doesn't appear on the 1910 census. Sorry for the typo. This is another ship record where someone reports that they're from Suwalki, which is Lithuania. This confused me for a long time because I didn't think that my relatives were from that section of Lithuania. And I will show you later why they actually weren't from Suwalki. They were from Savinashek, which sounds very similar to that. But you get lots of information regardless. They were going to a brother at 124 Forsyth Street, which is in Lower Manhattan. And this is a picture of my great-grandfather's brother. I got this from somebody who was doing additional research and who had this picture. I don't have a picture of my great-grandfather who died when my grandmother was 2. Here's another, this is the guy who traveled to San Francisco in 1916. And you can see we get lots of information about this guy here. He crosses out Grodno, which again is a province. He says he's from Warsaw, but he gets more specific and tells us exactly where he's from, which is a different name today. Things are misspelled all the time. This is why you have to look at original records. This actually does say Sussman, but it was indexed starting with a J. So once you know that something, you usually find these by accident, but once you know that it's misspelled, you can just pull it up and attach the record, and you can also make a correction when you know that that is an obvious mistake. So here's an example. We're going on to spelling mistakes. The Z's and the S's are often used differently. But once you have that information, you can go into JewishGen, and through Soundex, they will often pull up the correct record, that an S is going to be perhaps a Z in JewishGen. So this is Family Finder, and Family Finder is other people researching the same towns or the same last names. And it's very important to reach out to people. You certainly want to reach out to people who have been online recently. So in this case, this person was online in 2020 or more recently, And you can see the town, you can see how she spelled it through her research, and that can help you find the original towns, possibly. You definitely have to map everything. You definitely have to pull up some old maps. I had someone this morning ask me about mapping, and they said they can't find it on current maps. That's because you may need to get an older map and look in that area for that name. So moving on, city directories are amazing. You can almost get a family tree through city directories. These are the Silvermans and Savanowitzes that we were looking at from New Haven. They live at 36 Oak Street. And these are some of the children. Dora was one of the little girls. She's REM, removed to Miami. So that helps us figure out where she went. And Mona, one of her sisters born in the US, married a man named Samuel Soloway. So this is another way to get information on women that is often more difficult to find. Here's an example of Vera marrying a Lewis Weiss and moving to Georgia. And on the right, you can see that some of the people in my family had different businesses, like a coal company. And you can follow people that way. So newspapers are very important. I was sure that my people had not made the papers, except possibly for obituaries, but they did. And it was sort of the Twitter of the day, whether it was a small town or not. Some of my family actually appeared in the Brooklyn Eagle. And these are examples of different newspaper stories where, in the case on the upper right, this woman probably committed suicide when she was pregnant with her sixth child. And there are a number of women who were sent to insane asylums. All kinds of things came out in the newspapers. Gravestones are extremely important. It's sometimes you can get original names of grandfathers or fathers of people who died, but keep in mind that the people who are creating the gravestone at the end of someone's life may or may not have had the correct information. In this case, this is my grandfather, Sam, the little boy that we saw at the beginning, who was actually the third child, not the first child of my great-grandparents. And if you can read Hebrew here, what it says is that Sarah, the mother, Sarah Rachel, is what we knew, but we did not know that Michael's name was originally Yerachmael, which is what it says on the top line on his side of the stone. So that's how we got information that could help us with finding his original records through JewishGen overseas, although I haven't found them yet. Okay, so military records are my favorite. US military records for relatively recent, and by recent I mean in the 19th, 20th century in the US, because people often were more accurate about what they said on military records. There was a presentation last week, if you want to go back to the Civil War or the Revolutionary War in the US, but I'm dealing with more recent immigration for the most part in the US. And this guy was one of my grandmother's brothers who in 1917 registered for World War I and said he was born in Savinashep, Kovno, which is a district, Kaunas, Russia, which is Lithuania today. I was not researching this guy because I knew that he died in 1918, not in the war, but he was kicked in the head by a horse, apparently. So I wasn't researching him, but he's the one who actually told me the original town that my family came from in Northeast Lithuania. This is on the border of Latvia, and you can get information about the towns. And you can see that even though it's called Suviniskas in Lithuanian, it is Suvinishak in Yiddish, and that's what he was writing here on his He was sounding it out to the best of his ability. And again, that's what I think was on that ship record that was written Suwalki. Here's another one. This person is originally from Latvia and is giving the exact region and town on his registration card. So court records are amazing. They're a little bit more difficult to find, but on your handout, you will see that FamilySearch has a wiki, and the wiki is set up by jurisdiction, by place. And that's really the secret to all of this research, that when you start again, if you can't find your relatives through an index or digital index, which we can't for many reasons, because of misspellings, because we don't know where to start. You need to start thinking about place. So flip everything on its head and start going with place, and you will be much more successful. So probate records are amazing, land transactions, marriage. A lot of our ancestors married first cousins even in the 1920s when they were in the US. I thought that wasn't true of my family, but it is. So they're married, even though they lived in New York, they got married in Delaware or Virginia or somewhere that they could travel to that allowed that marriage to go forward. Divorce records are like Pulp Fiction sometimes. And I would encourage you to get divorce records. In this case, this is my grandmother again. She married what is perhaps her second cousin. I don't know if it's her second cousin on his side or her side. I'm still working on that. But you can see here that both of them had a first marriage. And so I went after both of those divorce records. And when I was looking for my grandmother's divorce record, she's from Connecticut, Willimantic, Connecticut. And one day when I sat down to rethink some of this, I realized that she was actually divorced in Woonsocket. And Woonsocket is not in Connecticut, it's in Rhode Island. And so when I called the Rhode Island people, again, going through the wiki on FamilySearch, I got phone numbers, I got emails. I actually spoke to someone who told me exactly what to do to get her divorce record. And she told me to go through a back alley, up some steel steps, and knock on a door, and make sure that I had lots of quarters in my pocket. And so I did that, and she had actually sent the records over there, and they wouldn't let me photocopy it unless I had quarters on me. They weren't going to give me any change. So sometimes people in agencies or record offices will help you. You got a 50-50 chance of them actually helping you or looking up something on a database that's not online. I'm really big on mapping everything, because you need to see if there's some locations that are similar, whether it's Brooklyn or Lithuania or anywhere else. And then sometimes you have to go to maps that were created in the 18th or 19th century, a lot of which are online today. I had an Uber driver drive me around Brooklyn a few years ago to see all of the locations that my grandparents lived. So I told you about the wine family from England, and their father used to joke about this place called Belayet-Surkov. And when my friend said this, she said, that's not the name of the town. He just uses that, sort of like Fiddler on the Roof. It's a made up name. But when I looked it up, and when I looked for her family, I actually found that they were from Belayet-Surkov in the Ukraine. There's another map that was from Family Papers. And again, we're getting lots of different ways of spelling things and different ways of viewing the surrounding towns. So family lore, I have written something on the handout that says that you should call your relatives, even the ones that you don't like, or email them, or email their kids, because maybe they have information that their parents might not have wanted to talk about. But regardless, I have received a lot from personal papers or little notes. For example, I'm sorry, this is out of order, but this is the record from Belaya Surkov in Kiev. So again, JewishGen comes into play here when you do know the name and the town. So here's a family paper. This was not a case where we weren't in touch with the relative, but they didn't want to give us this letter because it made them so sad every time they read it. This particular woman was an English teacher in Kaunas, Lithuania. And one day when my mother called her relative, the woman's son was home, and he said something like, "For goodness sakes, just send her the letter." And he made a photocopy at that point and sent it to her. So this woman actually died in the Holocaust, but we do have a photograph of her, which we wouldn't have had otherwise. This is a note that we found when my father died. And you can see from reading this that there was a pregnancy. This is the case that I told you about earlier, that perhaps there were 10, 12 pregnancies, but my grandmother only had one child. And so I have some death records of babies that she lost, but for the most part, we don't know about them. And this is a situation where my dad was saying, you know, he was 6 years old when this baby died. And I kept saying, no, 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 you were 4. But the truth is there were probably 2 pregnancies and he wasn't aware of the one when he was 4. So the handout will remind you of everything I've talked about, but what I want to really put forward for Jewish genealogists is that you become well-versed in using the catalog on FamilySearch. And FamilySearch has billions of records that are all organized by place. You can do searches by name, but only 25% of their records are actually digitized and searchable, which means 75% are not. So there are records sitting there that are not indexed, but it is possible to learn how to find those records on FamilySearch that are not indexed. Okay, so you're going to get an account and you're going to use the catalog. You can use all of these other things, the records, the images, everything else. But if you don't know your names and towns, start using the catalog and look at the videos that I put on the handout about how to do this searching with unindexed records. But I'm just going to give you very quickly, let's say your family was from Cleveland. You're going to go through a search like this. And if you haven't done this before, regardless if it's Cleveland or St. Louis or some place in Australia or England or South Africa, you're going to go to, because this is all very standardized, you're going to, if they have records, it will be standardized for every place in the whole world. Go to Vital Records first. Start there and see what you can find. These are all free. Some of them will be locked, which means that you will have to go into a family history center, which may or may not be open right now. But many of them are not locked and you can download them from your home. Here's a slide for the FamilySearch wiki. I encourage everyone to use this because you need to turn on its head what you've been doing. You've been trying really hard to find your family through searching names, through digital indexes, and it's not there. If it's not there, start looking by place and start writing to people and reaching out to people to get information where they lived, no matter where in the world. So as a final slide, I'm just going to give you a little bonus. In doing the research that my family did, we came up with a copy of the Sussman News, and it is now searchable by name and place. And so if you think that your family was from Northeastern Lithuania and has some of these surnames, although I wouldn't count on the surnames as an example of that, but you can download this Sussman News from my website, which is listed here. And you can do a search for your own names, or you can just read about what life was like in small Lithuanian villages in the 19th century. A lot of it has to do with sort of the Twitter of the day, where people were going to visit someone in New York City for the weekend. So you can ignore that part, but a lot of it is interesting about how people lived. So I'm going to leave you with that and turn it back to Avraham for questions.
Debbie, thank you so much. This was so informative and interesting and very clear. I'm sure everybody has greatly benefited from this and will from both the recording and also from this material that you're making accessible now. A couple of things that I wanted to add on. First, as what you just mentioned in terms of researching about what life was like. So an incredible resource that we have are the Yizkor books, which are these memorial books that were written by survivors in the immediate decades after the war, mostly. We translate these books and make them accessible online for free. And you can access them, go to the JewishGen.org homepage, or you could go to JewishGen.org/Yizkor. I encourage everybody to take a look at that and to see if we have a book for your town of origin. I also wanted to mention, in addition to the many resources that Debbie mentioned, as the home for Jewish genealogy, we not only try to have as much information as we possibly can, but also to guide and direct people if there are resources that we may not have but are somewhere else, as have been discussed in this program. So a few that I just wanted to mention, partner organizations that we work with are Gesher Galicia and Litvak-Sig and JRI Poland, the other Jewish organizations in this nonprofit Jewish genealogy sphere, along with many others, IGRAs and others. We make the search results from these partner organizations available on the JewishGen databases. So you sort of have this one centralized location where you can access all this information and then jump off to the various organizations depending on what record you're looking at. So I would also encourage everybody, when you see these records appearing on JewishGen, visit those websites as well. That's Gesher Galicia and Litvak-Sig and JRI Poland. Very worthwhile organizations with unique material that could be very valuable in your research. So Debbie, there's been a lot of comments, a lot of people saying thank you. That was very interesting and informative and very appreciative of and all the hints that you gave. So I'm looking through the Q&A that people have posted. There's a lot of general questions, which we're not going to do. I'm just going to call some of them out, Debbie, and you can tell me if we should go into them or if not. And some of them you sort of covered, but maybe it's worthwhile to repeat. So actually, the example that you just gave, if town names seem different in several different countries or at different time periods, how would people go about identifying the contemporary name of the town?
So that's tough. You could go to the town finder in JewishGen and then just play around with the vowels, because people, like you saw in my examples, are doing the best they can to sound something out. But JewishGen is very specific about the sound X. And so if you have an E or an I or an O in the wrong place, it's not going to bring it up. So play around with it, but also look back at your original sources and see if you can sound it out as if you were a Yiddish speaker and write it out yourself and then try that. But also pulling up those old maps, if you know the region. I've done this around Pandelis in Lithuania. Several of the villages that my family are from do not exist today, but they do show up on the older maps as the names that were passed down, or the town names. Yeah.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I'll just add that we have a sound X on JewishGen. So if you type in phonetically how you think something sounds, there's a very good, capable and robust system that can help you identify the various towns where you came from, and that's called the Jewish Communities Database. Also, you can find it on the homepage. I'm looking for some more questions that are not specific. If anybody wants to post, you can in the Q&A. Okay, here's a general question. Are there any special considerations in requesting death certificates, as some jurisdictions are reluctant to provide them to persons other than spouses and children?
Okay, so it depends. You have a 50-50 chance. When I ask for death certificates, I mean, there are laws in certain countries. I believe England is 100 years. It's different by state in the US because you can find a lot of things online for Texas and California that are not allowed in New York and Connecticut. So the best you can do is, if the information is not online, write to the jurisdiction, which you're going to get through FamilySearch Wiki or Google, and ask or order the death certificate. I have received death certificates for people who have died relatively recently, and I just say that I'm a granddaughter or whatever, and they usually send them. You have to sometimes pay $10 or $15.
Thank you. I see people writing in the chat are giving good hints also. Just in general, searching newspapers and local genealogical societies often have smaller data sets, many of which we hope will be on JewishGen, but it's always worthwhile taking a look. I would also say that use the networking tools and opportunities that you have on JewishGen and online. So you can go on the discussion group and you can ask some of these questions and be more specific. And you can say, you know, here's what I know about my family. Here's where I'm stuck. I have this specific question. Can anybody help me? That is really a good opportunity for some of these more specific and personal questions, because you might find someone else who has information that's relevant to you, or it could at least guide you further in your next step. So sign up for the discussion group. On Facebook, we have the Jewish Genealogy portal. There's also a social media group called Tracing the Tribe, which is also very popular. Both our group, the Jewish Genealogy portal, and Tracing the Tribe have like 40,000 members who were signed up. So you have a tremendous opportunity to connect with people and in large numbers. Okay, I'm looking back in the Q&A. Let's see. Question, have you used DNA in your search?
So of course, I use DNA all the time, but if I didn't have the paper trail, I would not be able to connect people. So I have an extensive paper trail now, and I can pretty much plug in relatively close relatives. Either they're already on my tree, or I realize they're the child of somebody that is on my tree. So that's working with relatively close relatives, someone who has over 100 centimorgans and some significant segments of DNA shared. And of course you should do DNA but it's not going to get you this information unless you happen to hit on someone who's already done the paper trail research.
You mentioned it briefly. There's a number of people asked this. Can you clarify names that were changed when people came here and speak to the myth a little bit about Ellis Island?
Okay. So if I went to New York last week, I had to have a driver's license to get on the plane. People had to have papers to get on ships. Were they false papers? They could have been, but for the most part, they weren't, or when they had papers to get on a ship. That's how they were transcribed. Now I'm talking about mostly in the late 19th century, 20th century. Before that, it might have been possible to walk on a ship at times, but for the most part, you had to have papers. So when people ended up at Ellis Island, those papers were recorded. So they didn't change their name at Ellis Island, but they did change their name when they got off the ship and realized that there was some discrimination, or there was a name that they preferred to be called in the US or in Australia or South Africa. They did change their names. They changed their first names and their last names. They used perhaps the same first letter, but not always, as we saw. And my grandfather changed his name in 1927, officially, from Swirsky to Shaw. So when my father was born, it was Shaw, but there was paperwork there. Many people did not change them officially. And people in the same families often use a different name. So the Safanowitzes are often Safners or Saft or another name. Even brothers had different last names.
We'll do one more question, and this just has to do with your own research. Was there any one major breakthrough for you that really was just this amazing experience?
When I found my grandmother's birth certificate, which was really hard because she lied about her age. I mean, you see that on the census records all the time, but also finding the death records of these babies that died who would be my aunts and uncles was huge. And there again, I had to turn something on its head. I was looking for birth records for all of those babies that I said my grandmother had. I was looking for birth records. They didn't live more than a day. They were premature babies for the most part. And so I found death records. And so those are huge for me because I would have had these aunts and uncles that I didn't.
Okay, I thank you. I think we are going to wrap up. A couple of things I saw in the chat also. And again, thank you to everyone who has participated from around the world. We have more than 1,100 people who are on today. And there have been a lot of things in the chat. And so I apologize if you were asking questions in the chat and I couldn't read them. They're coming by so quickly. I did point out a couple of things. People left helpful hints about using Steve Morse's website in terms of ports of entry and other tools that he has. People asked just in general about Inquisition, just a variety of topics. And we have a crypto Jewish research division, which people might be interested in. We have a Sephardic research division with a new database that we just added over this past summer, the Jeff Malka Sephardic collection, which you might want to take a look at. So I encourage you all to take a look at JewishGen, and as I mentioned, the other websites as well. There is a wealth of information available. And also don't forget about leveraging the ability to connect with others on the Family Finder, the discussion group, the social media, tremendous, tremendous opportunities. So thank you, Debbie. The recording, as a reminder, the recording will be made available. We put it online on the JewishGen YouTube channel. Please subscribe so you can be notified of the video and others as well when they're made live. We'll also post a message on the discussion group. So just one more plug to please sign up. We will send out an email as well when the recording is available. We'll also include the handout and also the extra information that Debbie gave at the end and the links to her website. In the email will also be a link to a survey. It should take about 2 minutes to fill out, and we would be very appreciative if you could. It will just help us understand our audience a little bit better and to make sure that we continue to schedule programming that will be of benefit to our community. So Debbie, thank you again for this wonderful presentation. Thank you to everyone who is joining us. Our next talk will be next Wednesday, and the topic will be on researching criminal ancestors. That will be with Ron Ahrens, a very interesting talk. We will send out a link later this afternoon so you can register, and wishing you all a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you again for being with us.
Thank you.